So, my character's name is Shina. She grew up in Wineport, Eastern Lonoskea, close enough to the resort town of Costa del Sol and all its excitement. That said, her family was more focused on the merchant's life. Her early schooling was in Limzila, but she eventually moved to Gridania to begin her training as an adventurer, taking up the lands and eventually graduating as the Azure Dragoon in the frozen realm of Ishgard. You're probably wondering at this point why I'm reciting what sounds like the beginnings of a fanfiction, and well, that's probably not totally wrong. Something I would add though is that I didn't really start writing this backstory till several years later after I started playing Final Fantasy XIV. You see, at some stage in Final Fantasy XIV's narrative, a split began as far as my character was concerned. It wasn't merely me playing a game anymore, it was me playing a character. Let me elaborate a little more. You'll notice that in previous Final Fantasy games, the character you played had a name. They were on the packaging, they were on the advertising, they had their own history. FF7 had Cloud, FF10 had Titus, FF13 had Lightning, you get the picture. So when I speak to friends about FF14 who don't play it, they ask me some valid questions. How can this really be a main numbered Final Fantasy game when the main character is, well, you? How can you explain partying up with random people? Doesn't all this break immersion? And to all that, I feel Endwalker solidly declares, I am a Final Fantasy game, and that's what we're here to discuss today. But let's go back to the start. Character creation. This and the majority of A Realm Reborn, I would concede, is probably where this game is more of a stock standard MMORPG than a mainline Final Fantasy game. It's not common for you to start an FF game creating a character from scratch, but it is in an MMO. As your journey into the story continues on, there is more and more emphasis on group content, again, another MMO staple. Other stuff like PvP and player market board are introduced, and yeah, MMO through and through. In effect, the developers copied a lot of the concepts of what made Western MMOs of that time a success. Labeling a game as an MMORPG has definite differences to being a pure Final Fantasy game, and at that point in time, in my opinion, it was a smart move to first hook people in via the MMO angle, because a genre has wider appeal than a singular title. Hence, for a big portion of the game and its subsequent marketing, the general gaming community easily labeled Final Fantasy XIV as a different beast compared to the likes of FF15, 13, and every other Final Fantasy prior. Fast forward to Heavensward, and personally, I would still argue that this mentality that FF14 is an MMO rather than a classic FFRPG is still quite prevalent. The Alexander raids being very punishing and being known as the destroyer of statics really cements this perception that FF14 can only be done in a group. There is, however, a turning point where Final Fantasy XIV needed to decide for itself what kind of game it was going to be, and that moment was prior to the Nidhogg fight in patch 3.3. This moment here, this walk to face a monstrous dragon. See what's going on here? It's subtle, but it is significant what you've caught on. The fact is, your character is having a hero moment, and it's doing that by walking. It's doing so without any input from you. Now, you can argue that prior to this, your character has done things in cutscenes that were not under your control. For example, at the end of the Praetorium fight, your character is catapulted out of the burning wreck while piloting the Magitech armor. But the difference here is that your character in that scene, and pretty much all other scenes before it, was always being swept up by the momentum of the events transpiring. Throughout ARR and most of Heavensward, you always got the sense that you were being led this way and that to progress the story. As you faced Nidhogg, your character decided that while everyone else was running, they were going to walk. At least in my experience, this was the first time I thought, whoa, My character is such a boss. This moment is where the developers chose to put the spotlight on your character rather than just the story or the events unfolding. It's the moment where you saw your character as separate from you, the player. From here we zoom to Stormblood MSQ, specifically the Yanxia quests. There's a couple of things that I want to talk about here. The first is your character's expressions, and the second is their defeat. Your character has shown more and more, well, character in the cutscenes they appeared in. They wince in pain, they look confused and startled. As much as they don't say a word, their reactions were at least apparent. The stoic nod is still there, but it's no longer the only thing that your character can do. And then there's the moment where your character for the first time is actually defeated. Again, it's a subtle difference between the feeling of impending doom facing Ultima and the Ascians in A Realm Reborn versus seeing your character actually shown to be weak against this new foe, Xenos. To achieve all this, cinematography was definitely improved with more tracking shots and more succinct zooms. In particular, there was greater focus on your character's expressions, especially when they're in pain. I guess as a photographer, these kinds of things stood out for me, but the way a camera swishes past a scene matters in setting a pace. The angle and tilt can mean the difference between a quirky scene and a nightmarish vibe. The perspective can either belittle or uplift your character's demeanor. You get the picture. At the end of the day, this is why I refuse to concede that Stormblood was a mediocre expansion. This is where they dared to be more. Without delving too much into spoilers, I can say that Shadowbringers just further dives into our character's backstory, and I mean way back. By this point, I could solidly say that I was no longer a player role-playing a character in a massively multiplayer online world. I was now empathizing with my character more than my emotions projecting into the character. I felt sorry for her. I felt extreme elation at her triumphs. I relished seeing her relationship with her friends grow. I was proud of her. Now with Endwalker, what we have is Yoshi P and crew realizing their goal of having always wanted to helm a mainline Final Fantasy game. With the implementation of more and more dungeons that you can run solo and some really great fourth wall breaking in the story, we're well on our way to having a game that is played much the same as any other FF. To top it off, the fact that the main story actually legitimately ended with Endwalker means you can say you now have a fully fleshed out game from start to finish. None of this bait dangling to keep you subscribed endlessly. Don't get me wrong, I love the MMO side of Final Fantasy XIV. The community is great, and personally I will always run daily dungeons and raids with people. And I still highly recommend others out there to actually delve into this side of the game because it's seriously rewarding. But I'll also always be a story guy. I will always wait with bated breath for each new patch for the new chapters in the Tale of the Star. As such, finally, I can say that I've actually finished a proper Final Fantasy game. It's probably no surprise that this game has massively impacted my life. Putting aside how it brought me closer to friends and also made new ones along the way, the story itself offers some life lessons that will last with me for the rest of my life. But above all that, I'm glad to witness a character as engaging as Shina, the warrior of light, a true Final Fantasy character. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next adventure. Bye!